Hey everyone, welcome to Lesson 4. In Lesson 4, we are going to be discussing different multi-way situations. Here are some of the topics covered today. First of all, we will be talking about how we should be handling limps in front of us, raising ranges, limping ranges, and post-flop play. Next, we will talk a little about what ranges we should be using to squeeze, and I'll provide some basic post-flop tips as well. And lastly, we'll have some examples on how to handle multi-way situations in single raise pots. Preflop play facing a limp. So here are some factors to consider when we are deciding how to handle a limp in front of us. Number of limpers. So when there are more limpers in front of us, there is a lower chance of having a successful isolation race. So why do we call a race behind a limper an isolation race? It's because it's usually done with the intention of isolating the weaker player and playing heads up against him. So what you'll find is that if you have 5 limpers in front of you and you put in a race, the chances of getting it heads up is going to be pretty slim unless you actually make a really large raise. So I would urge you to consider limping behind with some low hands when you don't think you have a lot of full equity, and if you don't think the probability of being able to isolate a single opponent is very high. Next, position is also important. I think both pre-flop as well as post-flop position is important. I would ISO raise a limper very tightly in middle position, but I'll be a lot wider in terms of my ISO raising range when I am in the button. Of course, being out of position post-flop also determines how wide we should ISO raise. I think that a lot of players tend to float a lot more when they have position, so you want to be a lot more tighter OOP. So let's just talk briefly about basic ISO raising ranges. I didn't really cover this in season 1 of Yolosaurus Goes All In, so I will just try my best to cover them here. In the cutoff and in earlier positions, I think you can just ISO raise with a fairly similar range to your opening range. So if you are opening 15% from MP2 in a 9 max game, you can probably just ISO raise with the top 15% of hands. Deuces plus, Ace 2 suited plus, King 10 plus, Queen 10 suited plus, some suited connectors, Ace Jack off and King Queen off. If you were opening from the high Jack, I think an 18% range looks pretty reasonable. Just add a bunch of weaker hands like Jack 9 suited, Queen 9 suited, King 9 suited, Ace 10 off and King Jack off. From the cutoff, you can probably open between 20 to 25%, and you can also ISO raise a similar range here. Just add a few more broadways, a few more suited connectors, a few more suited one gappers, and you'll get there. From the button, I don't think it would be a good idea to ISO raise as wide as you would open. I think ISO raising 50% is a bit too wide. You open yourself up to getting 3-betted a lot from the blinds, and your ISO raising range would often lose to the vicious limping range. So I think a 30% range is fairly solid. I'll pick a bunch of high cards, high suited hands, some suited connectors, some one gappers. In the small blind and in the big blind, I think you can actually complete pretty wide from the small blind, but I would exercise a lot of discretion when I'm ISO raising from the blinds. Sometimes you could raise up to 30%, but in general I try to be a bit tighter. It never really hurts to play more cautiously. So limping ranges. I don't think we are going to be open limping. I guess open limping could be okay in like a full ring game. I do open limp on more passive tables when I play live, but in general I almost always avoid open limping. I usually do not limp behind my opponents very often against one limper. If there are two or more limpers, I will often consider limping. If there's a single limper and my hand isn't too strong and he's kind of stationary, I might limp in the button. In the hijack, I think with like 4 players left to act behind us, I try not to limp too much. I feel like we get squeezed out of the hand way too often, so I think it's okay just to not have a limping range there. From the cutoff onwards, I think we can start to construct a limp behind range. So yeah, you can see there are some overlaps. Hands like 6s to deuces, small pocket pairs, small suited aces, some low to middle suited connectors, some weaker broadways. You can consider limping with these hands. I'm not saying you should always limp these hands. Look at the various factors. If you think the chances of getting it heads up is very low, then you should just limp. If your opponent folds a lot post-flop, then ISO raising is better. Then you can just c-bet bluff on plenty of flops. If your opponent is a mega station, then sometimes it might make more sense to limp behind with these weaker hands. For the button, we add a bunch of suited queens, suited kings, and some middle connectors. I think that works pretty fine. In the small blind, I actually like to complete a really wide range of hands. So we are raising the top 20% of hands, so we complete the middle 44% of hands. I think we're just getting really good pot odds here, and thus we should just be trying to play as widely as possible. When we are out of position, I guess fishers might want to be floating a lot more often, but still I think it's just too good of a situation to pass. We are getting like 5:1 pot odds. We are receiving pot odds of like 17%, which is a really good price. The big blind rarely squeezes unless he has like the top 20% of hands. And with a limper in front, he's probably a weak player. Of course, the pot odds gets even better if there are multiple limpers. So yeah, similar groups of hands, suited kings, suited queens, suited aces, some low pairs, suited jacks, suited tens, some low to middle suited connectors, some offsuit connectors, some random 2 high cards and above, 2 middle to high cards like 7x plus. So why are we limping so wide from the small blind? So the answer is pretty simple. When your opponent is a fish, it's going to be really easy to make a lot of money. When you hit, you can extract a lot of value. When you miss, you can just bluff cheaply and take the pot down really often. When the big blind checks, he is probably going to be pretty weak. He's going to have the bottom 70 to 80% of starting hands, depending on his raising strategy. So now let's discuss some post-flop play in limped pots. Here are some things to remember. Usually we are going to be up against fish, and fishes tend to play really weak when their initial investment is only one big blind. So I would be very inclined just to bluff very often on drier flops, especially heads up. My general strategy would be to lead out mostly with top pairs and draws. Sometimes I might go for a check raise if I had a monster, like a set or a top 2, or a straight. So you'll find that limp pots are generally like only a few big blinds. Limp pots will tend to only have a few big blinds in them. So in order to play for stacks at 100 big blinds, you need to put in a raise somewhere. So this is the reason why I like to go for a check raise with some monsters. General rule of thumb, just bluff small. So I would half pot on the flop. I guess that goes against building the pot with a strong hand. but I typically like to check raise as mentioned earlier. I guess you can just play imbalanced, and you can just pot it with strong mid hands or with draws. So you are going to rarely see Limped Pot play at higher games, but at lower games you have plenty of fishes limping in front, and even the Rex tend to play really passively in Limped Pots. So I think you can just turn up the level of aggression very often. And it's also important to look out for bet size imbalances from Rex, which is the exact thing I mentioned earlier. Betting small with weak pairs or bluffs, pot betting with strong made hands or draws, and when you think your opponent is weak, just re-attack him more often, especially when he uses a smaller bet size. So we have example 1A here. We have a dry board, and we have a 3-way Limped Pot. So here, the small blind has 2 overs and a backdoor flush draw on a pretty dry board. It's pretty hard to connect with this board. Let's say that the cutoff is a 29-3 player, VPIP PFR, and the big blind is a 25-20 player. So here are some of my assumptions about their ranges. I'm assuming that the big blind has the bottom 80% of hands, and I'm assuming that the cutoff has the top 35% of hands. So let's ask ourselves this question. How often will each player have something that can call? So this is the range I have given to the big blind. So on the left side, I gave him like a 78% range. I guess it's not, yeah, it's the top 80% of hands, but I took into account the flop. So you can see the 6x and the 2x hands are discounted, so we are only left with a 78% range. And out of all the hands with a 6 or a deuce or a flush draw or a straight draw, we are only left with 27% of hands. So effectively the big blind is only defending like a third of the time. We see something very similar for the cutoff. If I assume that the cutoff is limping 35% of hands, I'm just assuming he's raising queens plus, ace king, ace queen, ace jack suited, king jack suited, king queen suited. I'm not really sure what a 29-3 player would raise, but something like that looks kind of reasonable. So I gave him this sort of range, and yeah, even if I assume that this player would defend all 12 combos of ace jack off as well as king queen off, he's still only defending a third of his range. So our full equity against the big blind and cutoff is approximately 2/3. When we think about our combined full equity, we are getting about 43% full equity here. And when we are betting half pot, we only require about 1/3 full equity here in order to auto profit. So I think we have a pretty profitable bluff here. Not to mention the fact that we have some outs to improve. Okay, so we have the same board, just that the small blind has the nuts now. Not the nuts, but a really strong hand. He has trip 6s. So let's talk about some exploitative play against inelastic defending ranges. So with a strong hand like a 6, I would probably pot the flop. If I had air like king 8, I would half pot the flop. With a stronger trip 6s like ace 6, king 6, queen 6, I will strongly consider check raising the flop instead. Example 2, wet board. Okay, so now we have ace 8. The small blind checks, the big blind bets half pot. And the cutoff folds. What should the small blind do here? So the small blind opted to check. He's not sure whether he's going to check raise, check fold, or check call. I think all options could be reasonable. probably not check calling too much. I rather bet or fold. But given the fact that the big blind bets only half of the pot, he probably can't be too strong. So I think this is a good exploitative spot to put in a check raise. The big blind's half pot bet indicates that he rarely has a strong draw. Strong draw referring to open-ended straight draw or a flush draw. And he's also not having a top pair too often. So I think I would often just raise the flop here, and you could consider firing the turn and or the river. That depends on the opponent and the board texture. Moving on to example 3a. Heads up, limped pot. Okay, so under the gun calls one big blind, and the big blind checks with 7 deuce off. So we get a board ace 8-3. So it's a heads up pot, right? So should the big blind just bluff with pure air? We get the same spot, just that I changed the board texture here. Queen 8-5 rainbow. 10-6-5 with 2 clubs. Okay, so we have 3 different board textures here. And let's say that UTG can have 3 possible player tendencies. AT0, someone who's extremely loose and is playing every hand. Loose passive player. 28-15, probably more the typical fish you see at Stars. Someone who has some links but isn't that bad at the game. 45, someone who is kind of bad but not as bad as the AT0 fish. So I think in general I would avoid bluffing on the Queen 8-5 rainbow board against a tighter range, which is less than 40%. It's just very easy to have, for the opponent to have a pair or a straight draw which can continue on the board. And 7 deuce just has absolutely no potential. Secondly, I would just bluff very widely on non-wet textures against the AT0 player. This opponent will rarely connect with most flops, and he will fold very often. If you think he's really passive and plays very honestly on the flop, then you can consider stabbing the turn instead. The 28-15 player is probably raising high cards and limping low cards. I guess that is my expectation of how such a player would play. So my strategy would be to avoid stabbing without equity on low boards because it hits his range better. I guess an ace 8-3 board could be okay to bluff half pot, given the fact that we are assuming he's raising most ace-x hands pre-flop. So I guess we can expect him to raise like ace-queen, ace-king, and maybe ace-jack. So I guess he can have like some ace-10, ace-9 suited type of stuff, but he shouldn't have too many of those combos. And yes, it is hard to represent ace-x ourselves because we didn't raise, but the fishes are just playing fit or fold. They are not thinking too much about our range. So you can get away with exploiting them. Squeezing. So I think we can just 3-bet a third of our opponent's we can just 3-bet a third of the pre-flop raises opening range. So it's pretty similar to constructing a 3-bet range. I guess your multiplier can be a bit lower, like maybe 0.25 to 0.3. We generally want to squeeze a bit tighter. We also want to think about the number of callers in front of us. When we see more callers in front of us, I think you can consider squeezing low suited connectors. This is because when there are more players in the hand, your flush potential with a low suited connector is greatly reduced. So it's very easy to get flush over flush, to get coolered in such a situation when there are like 4 or 5 players in the hand. So squeezing accomplishes two things. Firstly, it reduces the stack to pot ratio. So when stacks are shallower, people are willing to stack off with weaker hands. Secondly, if you can fold your opponent off stronger suited connectors or suited aces even, then you are like cleansing your outs. So this was already mentioned in the previous lesson of lesson 3 advanced concepts. So I think squeezing with low suited connectors is good for cleansing your outs. With high suited hands like ace-x suited or suited broadways, I would prefer to just call and to keep worse draws in. So if we both hit, I can dominate my opponent. So if there's a single raiser and a caller, I don't really mind flatting offsuit broadways in the big blind. But if it's 4-way or more, I think these offsuit Broadway hands also tend to run into domination issues, so I usually use them as blocker bluffs. Like a hand like King Jack off, it doesn't really play well in a 4 or 5-way pot, so I would just squeeze it and try to force up my opponent off their hands. So if it's only 3-way, meaning there is a preflop raiser and one caller, especially when I'm in a big blind, I'll be very inclined to call offsuit broadways. It's alright when you hit a pair, it's easier to show down. And of course, it's a lot more valuable in a heads up or 3-way pot as compared to a multi-way pot. Of course, for the sake of balancing against stronger opponents, you can consider squeezing like ace-5 suited or like 10-9 suited, but again, when you are facing weaker opposition, I would very much prefer to call with these hands and use a more polarized 3-betting range. When we are in a small blind, I would be more inclined to play squeeze or fold. I think it's very hard to have too wide of a calling range, maybe some pocket pairs, some suited broadways and some suited connectors. I guess you're getting better pot odds in a small blind as compared to the button, but still not the ideal position to be calling very wide. Over calling in the big blind. In the big blind, our pot odds are really good, and I think a lot of nosebleeds players flat really wide in the big blind. As a general rule of thumb, I think they are going to be defending even wider than the opponent's opening range against a 3 big blind open. This is mainly due to pot odds. Maybe they may not necessarily be defending this wide, but I think at higher limits, the UTG player tends to open like 19%, so the 28% is justified. Maybe this might be a bit too loose against a 15% opening range. But yeah, it's pretty common to see them just call 9-8 off from the big blind against a 6-max UTG open. I see that quite a lot in Sauce123's videos at Run It Once, so he's a winning player, he's really strong, and I'm sure they do a lot of like database analysis on whether flatting such hands are profitable or not. So they should know better than us. So it's important to like study players better than us and try to rationalize why they are doing certain things. Example 4. So pre-flop, let's say MP raises to 3 big blinds, the button calls, the big blind squeezes with ace-king to 12 big blinds. So we get a 3-way multi-way situation in a 3-bet pot. The board is queen 8-6 with 2 hearts. We have the backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, and 2 overcards. Should we bet here or give up? So if both players have a tighter range here, so if they have plenty of middle pairs and a lot of like suited broadways, ace queen, then I think we should just give up. Your full equity is way too low here. However, if you think both players have wider preflop ranges, so it's important to look at their VPIP. If it's high and if they have a low 4 to 3 bet of less than 55%, then they will often have like some suited connectors. Then perhaps you could bet the flop and then barrel some flush turns. Example 5, preflop. So MP raises, button calls, the big blind squeezes again. We have another three-way situation, and the big blind opts to bet a third of the pot. So why do we bet small? First of all, I think it's just a very good spot to bluff small. People's defending ranges are mostly inelastic. It gives us a good risk reward ratio with our air hands. Let's say we have king jack, we can bluff very cheaply. And also, I think the pot is already really bloated. Our 3-bet size was really large at 12 big blinds, and it was 3-way, so the stack to pot ratio is a lot more similar to a 4-bet pot. So the stack to pot ratio is about 2.5, so I think a small bet is a lot more suitable here. Also, betting small keeps weaker hands in the hand. I think people will often consider calling with gut shot straight draws. King jack suited, king 10 suited, jack 10 suited. It prevents you from isolating yourself against ace queen. I think checking here is also a good alternative because ace king doesn't have 3 streets of value, and betting larger just isolates yourself against ace queen or better. Similar spot, king queen off. The big blind squeezes with this hand against a cutoff and a button. I think I would often call with king queen here, but for the sake of this example, let's assume that we squeeze. So the big blind opts to bet 1/3 pot as well. So I think here we have a very similar spot to example 5. The cutoff and buttons ranges here tend to be wider. I would probably be more inclined to see many more ace-x suited connectors and suited broadways. You could consider just firing small and then firing small on the turn again and then jamming the river. Just manipulate the pot carefully. Not saying you should always do it, but you can consider it depending on the opponent type, because it's really hard for your opponent to be strong, and it's just a board where your opponent doesn't have too many sets, so it's going to be kind of easy to push him off his pocket 8s over pair. Backraising. So let's say under the gun raises to 3 big blinds, the MP player and the button calls. The big blind squeezes to 14 big blinds, and it's folded to the button, so the button decides to go for a back raise all in. In this case, the button is risking 97 big blinds small to win 23.5 big blinds worth of dead money in the pot. So pocket 9s, if he was using a hand like pocket 9s to back raise, because people usually flat this hand, right? And it's a hand which is strong enough to back raise a lot of the time. Let's say the big blind has a value range of jacks plus and ace king, and he would 3-bet for all his other hands. So here we have 33% equity when we get called by the buttons, by the big blind's value range. So when the big blind folds, the button wins 23.5 big blinds worth of dead money in the pot. When the button calls, the pot will have about 206.5 big blinds. The button will get back 68 big blinds on average because he has 1/3 equity, right? So when he risks 97 more and gets back 68 on average, then he loses 29 big blinds on average. So let X be the minimum for equity for auto profiting here. So when X occurs, which is when the opponent folds, the button wins 23.5. 1 minus X is when the big blind calls, and when that happens we lose 29 big blinds on average, right? So you find out X, the value of X, which is 55.5%. So you will need your opponent to be 3-bet bluffing 55.5% or more in order to auto profit here with a back raise. So if we assume that our opponent would only stack off with Jacks plus and Ace King here, then you would need your opponent to have a range that is wider than 6.7% in order to pull off that back raise all in. Of course, someone with an 8% 3-bet range may be 3-betting Ace, Queen and 10s of value, so the 3-bet range shouldn't be considered in isolation. You should also look at his fold to 4-bet stat. So if his fold to 4-bet stat is like 60%, then the back raise gets really profitable. If the fold to 4-bet is like 40%, it means he has a wider value range, so back raising a hand like 9s may not be as ideal. So yes, maybe the back raise might be profitable. The analysis only shows that the EV of 4-betting all in could be higher than the EV of folding if the big blind is folding more than 55% of the time. However, we have not considered whether the EV of calling is higher than the EV of 4-betting. Lastly, let's talk about multi-way single raise pots. I think people just don't raise draws enough of the time multi-way, and I have to admit I'm probably kind of guilty of this as well. So I think when people are just not raising light enough multi-way, the best exploit is just to bet fold really often, especially if your main hand isn't too strong. So if let's say it's 3-way, I'm the pre-flop raiser, I bet, the small blind calls and the big blind puts in the check raise. I think this is a classic spot just to bet for most one pair hands, especially at lower limits. People's c-bet frequencies tend to go down, so it could make sense on wetter textures to construct a leading range, and maybe even on like low textures like 2-5 when you have pocket 8s, you might want to have a leading range. Not saying you should, but you should consider it. Consider using a 1/3 pot leading range with some parts of your range for thin value and protection. So I was studying some nosebleed players' hand histories. So True Teller, who is a very famous high stakes Russian player, used the 1/3 pot size bet, which I thought was pretty smart. He probably does it with a balanced range, but it's good for protection. Turnover bets become even more powerful in my opinion. So if let's say the big blind checks, under the gun and button checks back, on the turn I think it's a really good spot for the big blind just to overbet the turn and generate a ton of full equity. I feel like people give you even more credit when you overbet 3-way. Okay, so we have another example here. The small blind, the cutoff raises to 3 big blinds, the button calls, and the big blind calls with king queen off. So it gets checked around and the big blind just 2x pot the turn with the gut shot, a gut shot to the nuts. So I like this play a lot. So let's talk about the flop first. I think the big blind probably don't really want to have, he doesn't, or rather he shouldn't really have a leading range on the flop. It's a dry jack high texture. I think the cutoff would still c-bet bluff a decent amount with overcuts or with backdoor draws. On the turn, I guess the cutoff could still occasionally have pocket jacks, but both of the other players are more or less capped here, so I think having an overbetting range here is pretty good, and you just get more credit 3-way. Example 8A. So let's say the big blind flats with pocket 6s, 3-way. So this was the true teller hand I was talking about. And he leads out with second pair for a 1/3 pot. So of course the flaw behind leading this hand for a 1/3 pot always, the inherent flaw is that you make your hand really obvious. So yes, we are making our hand pretty obvious, This is pretty much the best hand to take this line with a small pair. Of course, you would need to do it with some draws and with some sets occasionally to protect your hand. Also, you cannot just always lead here, because if you are known to lead most of your hands, then whenever you check, your opponent can assume you're giving up. So he's going to be bluffing more often. So naturally there needs to be some sort of balance, but in general I think for this particular hand, against more straightforward opponents, I think betting 1/3 of the pot here is pretty nice as a play. So what are some of the benefits we gain by betting out here? I think we just gain thin value and protection. I think it just gets checked around way too often, and your opponent may have up to 12 overcuts. If let's say one guy has ace king, the other guy has queen jack, then your pocket sixes has a 25% chance of getting outdrawn. Even if they don't have it, there might be an overcut which no one hits, but someone could possibly go and bluff at it. So it also helps you to define your opponent's range. So many players will just fast play against the block bet. So when you probe bet like that and he calls, you can know that he's probably capped, so you can just overbet the turn. So what are some of the potential problems with having a 1/3 leading range on the flop? I think aggro players will pick up on your bet sizing tells and possibly attack you. So in order to prevent your opponent from being able to do that, you just need to block bet some strong combo draws, which can bet 3-bet or bet call. You can also do it with sets or 2 pairs. So we have the same example. Let's say that we get called by 2 players and we turn the open-ended straight draw. I think when we get called by 2 players, our showdown value is drastically diminished. Secondly, I think it's just too likely that someone bets on the later street and blows us off the hand. It's very hard for us to continue on like an ace, a 9, a 7, a club, even a king or a queen or a jack, or just pretty bad cards for our hand. So here True Tyler opted to turn his hand into a bluff. He puts in a slight overbet, which I kind of like. The under the gun and the button player are kind of capped here, so it's good to put pressure on them. So I think most players tend to play very straightforwardly in these spots. They will raise strong hands and draws. If 1 to 2 opponents call, you can just overbet bluff the turn with your draw. I think under the gun and button ranges are very clearly defined as draws or medium strength made hands after calling. Yeah, so as I said earlier, pocket sixes is no longer good against 2 players. You block 6-7, which is the nut straight, and you can just treat it as a semi-bluff here. Example 9. MP raises to 3 big blinds. The cutoff calls, button calls, and the big blind calls with ace 3. So it's 4-way. It gets checked around, and when the cutoff goes for a delayed c-bet, the big blind puts in a mega huge raise to 30. I think MP is giving up after checking twice. After the button checks back, no wait, the button folded, so the cutoff bets only 7 into 12.5. He's probably not too strong. I think if he had pocket 9s, he would bet a lot larger. Yeah, so when you check raise here, I think you're just wrapping a really strong hand, and you are going to get a ton of credit here. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Do the homework and I'll see you in the next video. So goodbye and have a nice day.